Hello, welcome to Dateline London. I'm Carrie Gracie, and this week, questions for the United States in Venezuela and in Yemen. And a British Prime Minister wins parliamentary backing for something, sort of. My guest today, Eunice Goes, the Portuguese writer, American broadcaster Michael Goldfarb, Alex Dean, who's a Conservative commentator, and the French-Algerian journalist Nabila Ramdani. Welcome to you all this morning. Now, alternative arrangements. It sounds innocuous enough, but with less than 2 months to go till B-Day, what alternative can the British Prime Minister find to the troubled Irish backstop that gets her an EU withdrawal agreement with Brussels that she can then push through her own parliament? Alex, get us started.
I think that this has been real progress, because the challenge from our friends in Brussels from the time that we voted to leave the European Union over 2 years ago has been, not unreasonably, what do you want, Britain? And for the first time, this is our Parliament sort of expressing a majority view in favour of something, which is very significant progress since the Prime Minister got an absolute shellacking on the deal at the recent so-called meaningful vote, which is we take all of the withdrawal agreement as negotiated with Brussels, except we need that backstop to be changed or rearranged in a certain way that will be agreeable to the parties. That is, of course, much more easily said than done. But the significant thing is, rather than focusing on that stumbling block, which is easy to focus on everything that has been agreed by our Parliament. Because these things have to go through both sets of political authorities, right? The European and the British. The British Parliament has just expressed approval for the withdrawal agreement in its entirety, with the exception of the backstop. That is significant progress.
Eunice, you were shaking your head.
Well, yes, because essentially what was agreed was agreeing on unicorns, because those alternative arrangements do not exist yet, and we don't know when they will exist. The reality is the backstop has been a pretext to stall the whole Brexit project, because the people who are raising objections to the backstop, they do not want a deal with the European Union. They want to leave the European Union without a deal. If it wouldn't be for the Irish backstop, it would be something else.
So you don't believe in the good faith of this position?
I do not believe in a good faith. Absolutely not. It is really shocking to see the scenes in Parliament this week were really shocking to see a Parliament pretty much giving up on its power, on its ability to influence such an important decision that is going to affect the lives of Britons for decades to come. This is really, really serious. We're seeing Britain being the victim of a political class that has abandoned any sense of responsibility towards the people they're supposed to represent, because essentially what everyone is playing at is, for how long can I hang on to power? For how long can I play on to how to get to power, and so on. And who suffers with this are British voters. The Irish backstop is a pretext. The Irish backstop is there.
So let's just let the others have a view on that. Alex, I'll bring you in a moment, but Nabila, first, you know, we've heard two very different analyses of the week that we just seen in Westminster. You know, which are you with Eunice or are you with Alex?
Well, I have to say that at the moment, nobody really knows what those alternative arrangements are. And I suspect that the EU will be willing to engage in renegotiations if those alternative arrangements are fleshed out. But this, of course, could take a great deal of time. And after 2 years of waiting, time really is in short supply. And I think that hammering out, you know, a renegotiated deal in record time is highly responsible and could have grave consequences. But I think it's highly significant that the whole Brexit process is finally boiling down to the Northern Ireland issue. A few issues in recent history have been divisive, have been more divisive than the future of the 6 counties. And now it's being combined with another issue that leads to just as much angry disagreement. And I've been to Northern Ireland recently, and I'm particularly disturbed to see senior British politicians discussing its future in such a cavalier fashion. And Conservatives, I have to say, and especially the most extreme Brexiteers, are particularly guilty of this, because it seems that they are prepared to accept any deal forged by Mrs May as long as the backstop is recast.
And yet, do you just a yes or no on whether you think it's recastable and get, you know, that she can get something past across Europe that she recasts on alternative arrangements?
Well, I think the primary role of the backstop is to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, and I would consider this particularly important. I've spent some time in West Belfast recently, and I've seen the wall separating Irish nationalist and loyalist communities. Curfews are still in place, and there's every possibility of hostilities resuming if hard border returns.
I'm going to let Alex have a word on that in a moment, but Michael first. You know, we've heard two pessimists about the week that we've just seen in Westminster, one relative optimist in Alex. Where do you sit?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I know we don't remember anything anymore past the last tweet that we sent out, but, you know, 2 weeks ago, I was down at Parliament on the night of the big vote when Theresa May got shellacked. By 230 votes. Historic defeat for any Prime Minister, and in any other kind of parliamentary form of democracy, that's a resignation moment. She's got to go. And I remember the headlines. Parliament has seized back control. And here we are 2 weeks later, and everything's fine. She came into Parliament, she said, with the Irish backstop, as negotiated in the withdrawal agreement, this is the best I can do. This is the agreement. Here she is 2 weeks later saying, oh, we can reopen it. So what I've learned in these last 2 weeks is that something that I think the Europeans who are negotiating know is that, in fact, in this country, the ERG, the tail, the hard Brexiting tail of the Conservative Party wags the entire dog. The entire country, not just England, not just Wales, but Scotland and Northern Ireland. And they, you know, and I think that the European view is, well, you know, they shouldn't be wagging the rest of Europe either. I think, you know, Alex has forgotten that, you know, many of the suggestions about how to avoid the hard border were explored over the last 2 years. David Davis had his ideas. Boris Johnson had his ideas about, oh, well, you have a camera on the border. You don't actually need to look inside. It's been gone over. It's not that we've arrived at this point and suddenly said, oh, well, we can have some flexibility here. No. This is a way, I think, of, you know, pushing, you know, it's a European negotiation. You push things to the last minute. Right. At 11:59 on midnight, March 29th, suddenly everything happens. It's like speed chess. And I think that's what they're doing, but it's a dangerous game.
On the timing, I agree. These things always tend to go late. But I don't agree that people have forgotten the lessons of the last 2 years. In fact, we should have been prepping before that because we failed to prepare for the one side of a binary outcome referendum that we had. But anyway, I don't think we failed to learn lessons from it, nor do I think people are being cavalier about the future of part of our country. I'm certainly not. But the point about the so-called backstop is nobody wants it, right? Nobody actually wants to call it into being. Well, it's an insurance. No, the point is it's an insurance policy that declaredly all of the parties say they don't want to enact. No insurance policy has an infinite period. You have to renew your policy from time to time. So I imagine that one of the ways that we will see the so-called backstop become acceptable to parties around the EU is that it has a time deadline set on it. And for argument's sake, that time deadline could be a very long one, 10 or 20 years if invoked after the transition period is completed.
So are you basically saying, Alex, that we see the Irish leader go to Brussels this week and that despite the kind of absolute no that we've seen to renegotiating any of this, that actually behind closed doors he's going to come under pressure?
I think there will be a conversation about the Irish being communitaire, about getting the deal as a whole over the line, which would mean not having no deal, being able to trade, and of course the Europeans getting the 39 billion. But on the timing point you make, I agree with Michael. It goes late. It will go. We don't see a final situation yet. It almost certainly won't be this week. It will go well into March before there are nodding heads.
And yet Theresa May has promised votes, you know, around Valentine's Day.
Yeah, and I imagine those votes will be basically
as meaningful as the other ones. You know, it's interesting to just say that I went down to Parliament for my podcast a couple of weeks ago for that big vote, and I ran into a couple of old colleagues who, you know, covered Maastricht, and I said, did you think 25 years ago that we'd be in this situation today, still having the same arguments? And nobody could believe it. And then one of them said, you know, I have no idea what's going on. And, you know, reporters, after 2 years of covering a story or commenting on a story, you sort of know what's going to happen. Nobody knows what's going to happen yet.
And there, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave this one, and we will obviously come back to it next week and the week after and the week after that, probably. So you get another chance. Now, though, let's move to a story that we don't cover often enough. Venezuela. It should be rich. Instead, it is desperate. Despite vast energy reserves, millions of Venezuelans are fleeing hyperinflation, shortages and crime. The man who presided over this crisis clings to power, while a challenger calls protesters onto the streets. So where is this headed? A dangerous moment, Michael.
Well, I think it probably is dangerous. But I mean, one of the things from in a different, almost a different hemisphere on the other side of the ocean, is we don't really have a sense of what's happening in the street there. Now, I had one reporting trip to Venezuela about a decade ago, and I listened to the program I made out of that. And I think that the critical thing that's changed is that it was a similar kind of crisis. People were out in the streets, they were protesting against Hugo Chavez, but when I went and reported, I said, well, actually, there's quite a few people that still support Chavez. Maduro seems to be losing the Chavistas. He's having to put very heavy pressure into the barrios that climb up the hillsides around Caracas. 3 million people have fled the country. But there's also another element. There's the almost 2 centuries involvement of the United States of America, not just in Latin America, but particularly in the Caribbean region. And if there's going to be a real solution, one, it's going to have to come from inside Venezuela itself. 2, what this particular administration, the Trump administration, has done so far doesn't make me terribly hopeful, because the point person they've put on this is a guy named Elliot Abrams.
I'm going to stop you there, because we're going to come back to the US involvement in a moment. But first, I just want to focus on the inside characters, because I don't think we know enough. A lot of us don't know enough about them.
Look, there's been this is an interesting kind of dictatorship. I mean, there is an opposition. Hundreds of thousands of people march through Caracas. There is brutal police repression, but it isn't a kind of totalitarian
dictatorship. So Maduro said, I mean, he tweeted over the past week that he's indestructible. Is he?
Who? Maduro? He's absolutely destructible. He's absolutely destructible, and I think that he can either take the easy way out and one of the... Well, look, there's... you know, we keep seeing this picture of a Russian plane on the tarmac at a military base outside Caracas. He can be in Cuba in an hour. He could be in a number of places. One assumes if he's halfway decent at his job, he's got a Swiss bank account full of enough money to see him through the rest of his life. No, he can be got rid of. He's not Chavez. Who is Guaido? Nobody knows.
Nobody knows.
You have a shot at that. Who is Guaido? I mean, 35 years old, relative unknown. What else?
I think he has the benefit of being a fresh face in Venezuelan politics, completely untainted by the past, so no association to the completely corrupt political parties that used to govern Venezuela before Chavez. And this is not an approval of the regime of Chavez, but Chavez appeared and was elected and re-elected because what was before was very far from perfect. So Juan Guaido is completely untainted by that past. He seems very genuine, he is charismatic, so he has a real shot, and he managed to assemble the support of the almost overwhelming support of the international community. Of course, Russia, China, Iran and other countries are not ready to recognize him as the interim and very soon to be president. The problem for him, the risk for him now is managing the support of the US, because if the US decides to become very muscular and tries to organize a military intervention in Venezuela, this can undermine his legitimacy in the eyes of the Venezuelan people. He will be seen as a puppet of the United States. And in Venezuela, in the whole Latin American region, the United States, any United States government has a terrible reputation. So I think he has to navigate this line very, very clearly. He gave an interview to Al Jazeera last night where he did not rule out the possibility of a military intervention. I think he has to be very careful, because at the moment, he has a lot of popular backing in Venezuela, a lot of international backing. He should not throw away all that capital so that easily.
Well, we're talking, you know, on what is Saturday morning, Venezuela time, and it's a big weekend with the protests called and with the deadlines that the EU big powers have set on Maduro calling new elections. So, Nabila, what do you think would make the military change sides at this point? Do you think kind of them seeing very, very big crowds on big Venezuelan cities will do it?
Well, I mean, it has to be said that the absolute tragedy of the Venezuela situation is that it has been trying for years, it spent years desperately trying to impose an ideology rather than pragmatically dealing with endemic socio and economic problems. And it's been almost 6 years since Maduro has been in power, taking over from his mentor, Hugo Chavez, in elections that are widely viewed as fraudulent, it has to be said. And he has pledged that the Chavez-style socialist project would remain in place, and that effectively meant a war against capitalism rather than trying to sort out the problem in an effective manner. Now, things have got worse ever since, and now you've got constant rioting, rampant inflation, a refugee crisis, and extreme poverty. And while the country is descending in absolute horror for the Venezuelan citizens, the prospect of a looming presence of Trump's America isn't helping. America has participated in the overthrow of dozens of Latin American governments, either openly or covertly, and there are even claims now that Trump's America is trying to assassinate
Are you basically saying the Americans should stay right away and not be getting involved at all?
Well, I'm saying that this kind of meddling often involves America appointing its own strongman, and that's exactly what Trump is doing with Juan Guaido. And regime change by America is of great concern indeed. And it's all, it's easy to forget that Venezuela has the greatest oil reserve in the world, by far more than Saudi Arabia. America has already imposed sanctions on Venezuela's state oil firm, PDVSA, and crippled its shipment, which amount to almost all of Venezuela's export. And, given America's legacy in its involvement in so-called oil wars, I wouldn't be surprised if America got sucked in properly into a conflict. People would say it's all about oil.
I wouldn't over-focus on oil, because, I mean, the social crisis is what's important. And Nabila points out something, yes, America has very bad history. There's one other aspect that you have to remember, is that Venezuela has very close ties to America. When I was on this trip a decade ago, I met a woman, solid Chavista, solid socialist. Her son was in America playing baseball. There's constant interchange. This is the dynamic that people up here don't realize about American relations into Latin America. It's like it's familial, except that your big brother is also a bully, and it makes for a very difficult dynamic.
Alex?
A lot gets put at the doorstep of America, but of course it's not just the Americans that have a responsibility to take a position on these questions, albeit proximity and history means they may be more urged to, and power may mean they're more urged to do so than others. We are too, and of course the British government's position vis-à-vis recognising Maduro or his rival has been under discussion of late. The trouble, I think, for our country taking a unified position on something which could be something we could rally around and have a specific position on, is that there's a very small portion of our left which is still in love with the idea of the socialist South American country, which Nabila completely accurately describes. The obsession of ideology over fact and running their country into the ground. The problem for our left is it's that small part of kind of 1970s obsessive leftism that is now running the Labour Party. And Jeremy Corbyn remains one of these people who's in love with that idea of the socialist Republican paradigm.
So the way he expresses it...
That's not a dynamic in our politics.
If he was here, he wouldn't say he was in love with it, but I think obviously he has said, outside interference is unhelpful, and other senior Labour figures have said regime change, remember Iraq, Libya, which is a fair point.
And there are fair points to be made along those lines, but my point is that I think history will look back and say Theresa May had an easier run than she would otherwise have done in Parliament over the Brexit period because Labour was led by Corbyn instead of anyone else.
Well, okay, we're not going back to Brexit.
But I mean, I think the thing is that I haven't read or been in touch with anyone who thinks that regime change is imminent. What I worry about, what I was saying earlier, Cara, is just that the point people that the Trump administration has on this make me nervous.
No, I understand.
And Elliot Abrams and John Bolton are both men who like to swagger it around. But I also think there's reality. And I don't think there's any appetite for any kind of military intervention. And I think that Maduro is more likely to implode.
Europe has been very cautious in its approach
I think Maduro is more likely to implode than anything else.
Respecting calendars and expecting new free and fair elections organized very soon. Now, and then we'll think, next if Maduro does not resign? What are the next steps? But the position from the international community has to be cautious and letting the Venezuelans also try to find their own domestic solution.
Yes. Okay. 20 seconds, Alex.
Because it's easy. I agree with that. But what you said was, why are we talking about Corbyn? And the reason we're talking about Corbyn from my perspective is, in our country, he's the closest we get to an apologist for that regime, and certainly was an apologist for Chavez, which explains part of how we got there.
He's a leader of the opposition and has no power whatsoever in this particular question.
And we're not going to get it. We're not going to descend into a discussion at this point about UK policy on Venezuela, because we actually need to move on to another country, which I suppose is a cautionary tale on what can happen when outside powers line up behind competing presidents. Because last year, the world's worst man-made humanitarian disaster was Yemen. And this year, it is still Yemen. According to a new US intelligence assessment, the war there has left 1 million people with cholera and 60 million with no reliable access to drinking water or food. The US Congress is increasingly uneasy about supporting a Saudi-led bombing campaign which costs civilian lives. But who will do what to end Yemen's misery? Nabila, I'm going to let you start on this one.
Well, referring to Brexit as a catastrophe is accurate. I mean, some people, described it as a catastrophe. Venezuela is, of course, an absolute disaster. But the horror that is still going on in Yemen is something else. And this has been highlighted, actually, in a recent documentary by your correspondent, Lise Doucet. Effectively, some 90% of the country's population are now in urgent need of humanitarian aid. Meanwhile, this savage war is still ongoing alongside famine and disease. At least 10,000 civilians have died since the conflict started in 2015. And as you said, a million people have cholera in the country. And despite all this, you have countries like Britain who have been pouring arms into the area for years, and they quite content to see a coalition led by their ally, Saudi Arabia, tearing Yemen apart. Trump's America is also supporting the Saudi-led coalition, despite attempts by opposition senators to change American policy. But an example of how much cynicism is involved are the thousands of mines that are killing and maiming unarmed civilians, including children, around the Red Sea port of Hodeidah mainly. And mines were a major issue in Britain a few years ago.
Okay, so Alex, I'm going to put, the UK and the US should be trying to help, but instead making things worse.
Well, we have a responsibility. It was a British, South Yemen was a British protectorate, of course, and one might argue that attempts to solve the conflict are admirable or laudable. But as I think we have learned the hard way in recent years, you generally can't bomb your way to peace, and that's the approach that the Saudis, who I imagine would say they're trying to end this conflict and reinstate the government which was being challenged by the rebels, who after all hold the capital. That's how they justify their actions. But my point would be, there's no real good guy here. And Saleh, until his overthrow, wanted to be president for life, tried to have their constitution suspended. Hadi, who was his deputy for many, many years, then basically led the same kind of kleptocratic regime that he'd been in before, and now wants to try and break up the regions into far more autonomous arrangements so that effectively you can control oil money a great deal better. There ain't no good guy. So you could argue, my point is, you could argue from a realpolitik perspective, put all your forces behind one, just pick a side. Put all your force behind one side in that, and then try and finish the conflict. That's as good as it can get for defending the current actions.
Michael, just one quick one on the US, because it's quite interesting. We can see another move in Congress to call out President Trump on his support of the Saudi bombing and that coalition, which he could argue that he's picked a side. Where do you see that going?
Well, I'm not sure I see it going anywhere, because in the end it gets completely pegged down by domestic politics. I mean, Republicans in the Senate, I mean, we saw this throughout the whole Syria thing, and yes, they want to either go in and be the good guys, or they want to pull back and be whatever. But when there's a Republican president, the Republican-dominated Senate majority will not contradict Donald Trump. Now, he has a whole range of different relationships, which we don't have time to go into in terms of Saudi Arabia because of business things, and we'll see what happens there. But I mean, I do think when I was listening to Nabila, there's nothing that she said that is wrong. The focus seemed to be on, well, if the UK and the US, I mean, we've seen Germany has said, well, we're not going to sell any more weapons into that region. And about 2 days later, the leading arms exporter in Germany said, hold on a second, it's business. Don't go there. But I mean, what I really think we need to focus on is Saudi Arabia and what it's playing at in dismembering this country, which sits just on its southern border. And, you know, and we haven't mentioned the Iranian dynamic that which has been alleged, and I'm not even sure how strong it is.
Last word to Eunice, we're running out of time. You literally have 20 seconds, Eunice, I'm afraid.
Well, this is essentially Yemen is yet another proxy war. As Michael said, conflict between, war for domination of the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and then the outside players who are subsidizing those two other big players. In the end, it's the Yemen people who are the real victims, the real sufferers, and there's really no end in sight because the UN is trying to do its best to keep a very fragile ceasefire. But no one seems to be interested in doing something to make it a reality, to make sure that at the very least humanitarian aid starts to flow into the country, much needed humanitarian aid.
And I'm afraid on that sombre note, we are going to have to leave it. That's all we have time for this week. Thank you all so much for joining us. Do join us to watch for the same time, same place next week. For now, thank you. Goodbye.